my presentation is called UX-driven technical writing. Why we should even care about UX? You know, nowadays it's quite overused word, like agile was some years ago, and who was not agile, it was not in or modern. So why a technical writer should care about UX? Because UX is something that actually happens in your mind and not on the screen. And anything you encounter in your life, it's UX. So by just looking at my presentation, you already have a user experience. And originally, this should have been more interactive. And let's say, it was a game that where I hit some elements you were supposed to point out. So let's do it in a different way. Try to look at the individual slides and feel for yourself if it's something that repels you or if it's something appealing to you. Because I put there some annoying elements, let's say this way, on purpose. So what are
Katka, now, okay, perfect.
Yeah, it was just intro.
Yeah. Sorry.
So no problem. What the presentation will be about, I divided it into 3 parts. First part will be UX introduction. I'm sure that you know what's going on, but let's do some short, so let's say, summary of important elements. Then I would like to compare in part 2 what UX designers do and what technical writers do. Don't worry, it won't be long, and I'm sure that you all know what you do, but there is a purpose to this part. And in the last part, I would like to show you how can you implement the UX principles in your writing. So let's get started. Part 1, UX practices. Don't worry, it won't be as complex as you see here, and I hope you will not be scared. So what is UX? As I already said, it's actually basically anything. I found a nice definition by Kuniavsky, who said that UX is the totality of end users' perceptions as they interact with the product or services. And by perceptions, he meant all these things. What's the most important thing is that UX is actually how you feel when you interact with either a system, a product, a service, a website, basically with anything. That's why further in the presentation, I use generic word product, but again, it can be anything. Here is one of the slides that should actually irritate you because it contains a lot of information. So if your user experience is a bit unhappy about it, it's all right. That's on purpose. Here I mentioned main pillars of UX strategy. The ultimate goal of the UX is to create positive user experience. Usually, let's say the goal behind this is to make you buy products or services or just spend some money on something. And as you see, it's quite complex because it consists of interaction design, which is basically anything you get in touch with. And the reason is that if you have a positive experience, it's engaging and you want to stick to it. The second pillar is information architecture. Again, that can be anything. For the websites, it's usually organizing information on where the user is, what they need to do to complete the task, for example, like filling the forms or buying a product. And the rationale behind the information architecture is clarity. Visual design is I think it's self-explanatory. It's anything you see, and this is connected to the good first impression. And if it's good, then you think that the product or service is credible. It has to be functional. So it has to allow you to complete the desired action. I'm sure you have encountered 1,000 cases when there was something annoying on the website and it literally repelled you from, for example, purchasing a product. The most important part of the concept is usability. We will get into it a bit later, but the main idea behind it is the user should not spend any time on figuring out how to use the product. And later on, you will see why. We already had nice presentation regarding typography, so I will not go into details. And what can be interesting for us is the content strategy, because as we already know, clear, concise, and engaging content, it's the best way how we can deliver meaningful information to the user. And this will help us to build up a long-term relationship with users and make them to come back to our product or to our documentation. As you may have noticed, UX is basically about psychology. That's another whole presentation, but it's the main reason why UX is subjective, because it's subconscious. Everything you encounter, experience, or see, or hear, it's processed through your brain, and it's processed through your personal thoughts, emotions, and past experiences. So what you might think it's not something that, for example, another user or reader might appreciate. So sometimes you cannot do anything about it. On the other hand, usability, it's completely conscious factor, and that's why it's so important, because either a product is easy to use or not. There is no other thoughts about it or no other experiences. Either you can use it and it's easy and it's fun, or not. Also, design should be functional, but we have to be careful because more often we are the experts. So we have to design the stuff the way that people who know less than we do can use it as well. By copy, I mean UX copywriting. We will also get into it a bit later. This element is here because it should help the user to achieve the result in the shortest and most straightforward way. And what we as writers usually don't do is the analysis, but it's a helpful tool because it ensures objectivity, and the statistics are clear. They show what users like, what they don't like, what works, what doesn't work. I'm sure a lot of things here sound a bit familiar when you connect it to your writing profession. So let's go to the part 2. What UX designers do and what technical writers do. As you can see on the left is just a joke from the internet, and also actually it's also a self-explanatory difference between user interface and user experience. And for the technical writers, let's say the generic assumption is, as Jirka said nicely at the beginning, we are just some grammar Nazis who just sit and write and nag about grammar and errors. But is it really all to it? Like to do some catch up and some editing? No, not really. I found nice definition on the internet what UX designer does and what technical writer does. If you would just read it quickly, you would figure out that the technical writer sounds more like well, technical, like they only gather the technical stuff, they transform complex and difficult input into clear and concise documentation. While the UX designer makes product enjoyable, usable, and accessible for humans. But if you would look further into the UX designer role, they also work as a part of the wider product team, and they advocate for the end users. And that's pretty much something that technical writers do as well, right? So are these two roles really that different? In the cross-functional teams, the people are usually separated, and of course it makes sense. But I think and I believe that because I see the similarities, technical writers are not only grammarists or just people gathering technical information and transforming it into something simple and understandable, but we are also a sort of designers. And that's what we can learn from UX design. And that brings us to part 3, when the magic happens. So I can explain it this way. On one hand, we have great design. And the great design, the core of the great design is purpose, benefits, and action. On the other hand, we usually use our user stories, and the core of the user stories is personal, need, and the purpose. What does it mean? If you look at the questions in the speech bubbles, these are the core questions that are involved in the process. On the left in the UX design process, on the right in the user story creating process. So if you do the design, you ask, what is it? How will it benefit me? What action should I take next? Well, when you compose a user story, it's usually who is the reader, because you say there is the formula as a someone, I need to do this, so I achieve that. So what do they want to do? What do they want to achieve? And even though this might look very different on the first sight, it's actually very similar. I would say the only difference is what is it and who is the reader. Because for UX, it should be self-explanatory at the first sight when you, for example, visit a website, what kind of product they offer. While we start with the audience, do we write for administrators? Do we write for experts? Do we write for dummies? But both groups are looking for benefits and actually for the actions to achieve their goals. And I selected a few examples from the UX design we could incorporate in our daily life. And I'm sure you already do it by, let's say, by nature or instinctively. But if you don't, I think it pays off to be a little bit more conscious about it. So what's usability? Usability equals cognitive load. And cognitive load is defined by amount of invested energy that is required to finish any single thing that I, as a designer, force the user brain to do. One example from the documentation point of sight, it takes less effort to read simple words than difficult ones. So if you don't have to think about something you want to do, the cognitive load is rather low. You save energy, it's not exhausting, and therefore you want to continue doing it. While if it's really something that is difficult, then you have to think about it, you have to have the energy to do it, and most likely you don't want to do it, or you don't want to go back to this, or you don't want to repeat it, or you postpone it. So UX design strives to improve this part, and what we can learn from that is to write a procedure in a way that user really doesn't have to think how to finish their task. I put here some usability strategies, how to achieve that. And as you can see, it really resembles the minimalism principles. So for example, simplification, it's basically that less steps required to finish the tasks are better for the users. There is a disadvantage because if you do this way, some information may be omitted. The steps should be concise. That means the better you describe them, the better the user understands and can follow. On the other hand, that means that user has to read more, which is contradicting the previous point. Faster finalization of the task, it's the way how to create the shortcuts. But this also has disadvantage because if you do it this way, it's easier to overlook errors in the process. And minimalism in this case means to do less, better way. On the other hand, for some users, if you overdo it, less is too little. So UX design says that the best approach is to combine and mix these strategies and use your common sense to find, let's say, the best ratio for your reader. Another part is findability. This is a very hot topic because there is huge information overload on the internet, and you probably know all about the search engines and how to find the documentation. And you should also know that user behavior in terms of searching can be divided into 3 groups. First is browsing. It's usually fast scanning. You just go there. That's the 8-second rule. You just go there, scan it, and the motivation is there something useful for me? If not, you are leaving. The second approach is to search. You're really looking for something, so spend more time on systematic browsing. And the third approach is random discovery, and you find something interesting just by accident, and that's usually what happens to me, and it's the reason why I'm always late for bed, because I always find something interesting and I start reading. What we can learn from that as technical writers, the crucial for our documentation is, first of all, relevance of the described topics, and then we have to use the keywords correctly. And also we can use the least popular discovery approach. We can add hints to discover more, and in case of Red Hat, it's called additional links or resources. So we are basically, again, we are doing it. Accessibility is another topic. It's usually connected to visually impaired or colorblind people. What you have to keep in mind as a technical writer is that screen readers for visually impaired people often read in order that is set in the code, or they read the content in so-called tab mode. That means the content that would be selected if you just keep pressing the tab key. And you can compose your documentation in a way that these readers can find the relevant information quickly. What we also do is, for non-native speakers, we use simple words and simple language. And it's always good to think from the perspective of your audience. But we cannot always please everyone. At least we should think about it or strive for it. Here is another thing that you should notice, and that's the terrible word I put up on the slide. And this is actually a bit bringing the attention to the UX copywriting. It's a very specific discipline because perfect UX copy is understandable, and you should immediately forget about it when it fulfills its purpose. And the goal of the UX copy is to keep the user interested and make them understand every step they are performing. We had previously very nice presentation about the errors, and that's a great example of UX copy. And as you see on the right side of the slide, I selected some examples. The warning about it's really confusing, and well, I would not like to encounter this one because I would have to think hard what to press, to be honest. And on the bottom part is comparison of the same error. The first is more difficult to understand what to do and what's happening, while the others is more understandable, and it's what we should strive for. So if your project contains any UI elements, error messages, or pop-ups, and you are, let's say, not the multifunctioning person, but there is a dedicated UX person for this project, it's great to offer your hand to write or review this copy, because we are trained hard in terms of critical thinking and minimalistic skills. And from my own experience, we've helped a couple of times to improve these messages. And that will make the end user happy. And maybe you will be the end user one day as well. And the last thing I would like to mention, just very briefly, because again, we had a nice presentation this morning about it, is readability. It's connected to typography, fonts, and now I hope that you know what term like kernings or reading mean. All of it also contribute to the user experience significantly. I selected different examples than you saw in the presentation. On the right, you have just our favorite lorem ipsum dolor paragraph. And on the right side, it's converted into smaller portions that are easy to read. As a technical writer, there are two options. Either we are talking about the website, product pages, or online help pages. That's something we have only very little control over, because this is usually developed by some other teams. But it would be always helpful if we could volunteer as beta testers or readers and provide the creators with our feedback. It's not like we can influence the colors or the fonts, but at least we can say, hey, this is really not readable and I think we should change it. And again, as for your own documentation, we are already doing it. Always use formatting, very convenient graphics, even though there are also discussions about that, like should we put them in or not, because they are harder to maintain. But in any case, it's great to strive for a clean text structure. So I hope this was a bit helpful for you. Take it as an overview of the day, and there is always something useful we can learn from other fields to be the best technical writers possible. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I will do my best to answer them.
Thank you, Katka, for a wonderful presentation. It was very nice. I enjoyed it. And I don't have a question, more like a comment. And it is about information architecture. Because I perceive information architecture as a balance between the user interface and the documentation. And there's the big question: what is supposed to go into the user interface and what is supposed to go into the documentation? Is it really so? If you have great user experience, well, I'm sorry, I'm confusing the terms. If you have a great user interface, is it really so that you don't need any documentation? So I guess it is a question after all. So any opinions about that?
I believe this is the ideal situation and the ultimate goal. Actually, in the last meetup in Brno, we had a guest that showed us. He was not a technical writer, and he showed us, I would say, a documentation of the future in a certain field, because they had like a 3D model of the product, and when you clicked on it, there was like small UX copy pointing you, for example, how to fix this, or what part is it, what's the part number. So in ideal situation, and of course it doesn't work for complex products, but you said, I think you work with some applications, right? So it depends on the application, but in ideal situation, the ultimate goal is you don't need documentation at all. And sometimes you might notice if you buy a new gadget, like recently I bought a new monitor for my home office. Well, there was just very short, like a quick reference guide, maybe I would call it. Few pictures how to connect the monitor, and it was it. So the products, if the products are designed the way that they are self-explanatory, you will not need the documentation. But I don't think we will be jobless anytime soon.
Thank you for your opinion. Anyone else?
I have actually opinion to the same topic, and I agree with Katka that we want to tend to not create any documentation. But I think that there are two things, and first is the software itself, and it should be self-explanatory, but sometimes the subject of the software is complex. It can be accountancy or firewall or just the subject what we try to accomplish with the software. And sometimes we need some explanations. It's important to decide, maybe the content strategists need to decide if general information on Wikipedia are enough, or if we need a special documentation for it. And what I especially like to use are learn more links from self-explanatory web UI or command line to documentation which tells you more if you need to learn more about the subject.
Yeah, isn't it Apple that you know, they believe that you shouldn't need documentation for their like UI on the iPad and the phones? That it's all easy and intuitive.
Yeah, it actually happened to me. I was maybe 10 years back. I tested and prepared documentation for mobile applications. And I had 5 mobile phones in a row on my desk. And there was a new iPhone. And what I had to do, what was my task, to connect my mobile phone to company Wi-Fi and download HTTP certificate, so users can use our webmail in the phone. And I spent 2 days with each phone to be able to download the certificate to the phone. It was not easy, believe me. Because, for example, one didn't support HTTPS by default, and you need to download via HTTPS. So I needed new firmware and things like that. And iPhone was able to connect immediately to a Wi-Fi, which was definitely not possible with all other devices, and then automatically downloaded the certificate, so I could immediately start the application. So I remember that we shouldn't we should be dreaming more and try to skip unnecessary steps if you try to design applications and user interaction with our applications.
What do you mean by skipping steps?
Because on each mobile cell phone 10 years back, you had to go through a lot of procedures because the vendors were persuaded that you need to select a lot of checkbox and select the mode in which you want to communicate and so on. And Apple was the first one who told you, okay, we will figure it out for you. If it doesn't work, you can change the settings, but there is a default settings and it works for 90% of all Wi-Fi access points.
Yeah, I see.
Things like
Thanks.
this.
Okay, I think this was perfect final presentation.